So, hey, everybody out there. At least I'm assuming you're out there. My name is Mike Pondsmith, and normally I start off any conversation like this by saying I'm the guy who killed your cyberpunk character. But since I can't see you, I can't really tell whether you're out there and whether you're playing cyberpunk. So we're just going to have to wing it. I'm honored to be this year's past keynote speaker. I haven't figured out why they called me to do this, but hey, it was a slow year. Speaking of years, I would like to say that even though I wrote a dystopian dark future about the world called Cyberpunk 2020, I am not going to take responsibility for what's going on right now. People, we're all on our own. Just stick together. So, one of the things that I was wondering about when I was approached about this honor is what I would say to everybody. I mean, there's a lot of topics, there's a lot of subjects, and my social media guy said, well, just kind of talk about your life, your career in the game industry, which I have to admit, I have a career in the game industry. It's not what I set out to do. The original plan was that I was going to become a special effects designer and build really big models of Star Destroyers. And somehow that got sidetracked. I haven't figured out why yet. But how did I end up doing this? I think that's actually a good topic because people ask me a lot of times, how the heck did you end up being a game designer? My mother asked that once, like, when are you going to get a real job? And I had to explain to her, I do have a real job. As far as I know, they pay me a reasonable amount of money. It must be a real job. And later when I actually taught game design, people would ask, how did you end up doing this? And again, I'd say, well, you kind of stumble into it because of the interest you have and the things that you come up with. So the best way to kind of describe this and how I got here and why I'm talking to all of you is to kind of go back through what passes for my career and how I got into it. So I didn't start out to be a gamer, and I didn't start out originally to be a game designer, although my mother reminded me a while back that I did actually design games in my spare time. And maybe one of these days I may even try to find and publish those rules. But I didn't do a lot of it. And part of that was you didn't really think about the idea that you could design a game. You didn't have game designers yet. You didn't have video games. All of that was way in the future, something science fiction. In fact, a lot of science fiction didn't really talk about it. So the question became kind of, how would I stumble into that? And the answer is dumb luck. I'll start with it. Most of my game design career is responsible to a guy named Greg Worth, an old friend who's passed on since. But Greg is the one who exposed me to the wild, wild world of nerddom, of all the cool, fun, off-the-grid kind of hobbies that we all share. Greg was an amazing repository of that. He knew the cool comics. He knew the really great music. He also knew gaming. And so he introduced me way the heck back to a group of people, E-Bang it was called. It was a naval wargaming group. And he said, come on, you're going to like this. So we went on down and we found a bunch of people who had little plastic ships on the floor. And we would figure out the distances and call up the numbers, and then we would claim to shoot at each other and blow up ships. Yeah, this was fun. I liked it. So a little later, Greg calls me up and he says, hey, come on down to my apartment. I've got something going. And he's got a friend who's out from the Great Lakes Naval Academy, the Merchant Marine Academy. And he's, for his friend, has this game called Chainmail. And I'm going, Chainmail, okay, well, it can't be that far from blowing little ships. And in it, you played an adventurer who went out and fought and did stuff in dungeons. And the next time this guy came by, he had a copy of Dungeons and Dragons. So there I am, and I play my first character. My character was a paladin, although the paladin role didn't really exist yet. And I went and waged war against orcs and things like that and ran around dungeons. And I really enjoyed it. My girlfriend at the time thought I was crazy, but I still would go over to Greg's. We'd have a really good time. The thing about role-playing is it is kind of addictive. You see other people doing it, and you start thinking, yeah, maybe they're having a good time. So maybe I should sneak on over there and see. There's a funny story that goes with that. So there we are in this apartment in Berkeley, and we're making noise late into the night, yelling and screaming, going, 10 hit dice. Oh, my God, natural one. Everybody yelling. And there's a knock on the door. Well, where we lived in Berkeley basically was kind of the strip area. And there were a lot of ladies of the evening who plied their trade near where we were. I mean, we were game people. We couldn't afford really cool places. And the knock on the door is from one of our neighbors. And she says, what are you guys yelling about? What's going on? I hear every night or so you guys doing something. And we go, well, we're playing this game. We start explaining to her about it, so forth like that. And she says, well, I'll tell you, after I'm done with what I got to do, make a living, maybe I'll try that. So she got involved, decided she would play a cleric. Now, I love the idea that a lady of the evening would end up playing essentially a nun. There was a certain sort of, I can take myself out of where I am and I can be somebody else. And that's really neat. That's what role-playing could give you, okay? So my weird hobby went on, and eventually, to make a long story short, I ended up going back to school at UC Davis. And as a student at UC Davis, again, this time trying to get a degree that I could actually use. It was going to be in design. My previous one was in psychology. You'll see how that all works out a little bit later in the story. Anyhow, so I started hanging out with another friend of mine that I'd gone to school with up at Davis. And he had just moved to a new house. And in the new house, it was one of those places in college where everybody comes from all over and they all pay their rent and they all have a room. And he said, you got to meet one of my roommates. She plays D&D. And I'm going, okay. And what I didn't know is that he was telling the roommate, yeah, you got to meet Mike. He plays D&D. So the roommate was Lisa. And we had met years ago, back when I was still a senior. I hadn't gone back to school yet. And we didn't hit it off real well. Actually, I met her when I walked into a room and she was dancing on top of a table with another person. And I ended up dating that person instead of Lisa. I'm not sure whether that made me any more lovable. At any rate, so she gamed. And of course, when I walked in, she kind of went, oh, God, this guy, right? But eventually, because I did game, I ended up in the role-playing game that she was in. Now, the amusing part was that this game was being run by her current boyfriend. And I show up in the middle of it. And it doesn't hurt that I had been working in a fairly rough neighborhood. So I'm wearing a army jacket, mirror shades. I'm carrying a 9-inch buck knife strapped to my hip, motorcycle boots. I'm working in West Oakland, okay? So I come into the game. And the old boyfriend decides, well, I'm not going to get rid of this guy easily. So I'm playing a bard. And he would plan how to get rid of me. So everybody else would be up on the line. And we're fighting things, various orcs and horrors and so forth, climbing over the walls. And he'd say, Mike, the Balrog lands in front of you. Yeah. Okay, right. This, however, did not entirely turn me off role-playing. And as time went on, I guess I must have not done something abysmally stupid, because eventually I was able to talk Lisa into marrying me. And we have been gaming for a ridiculously long time, at least 3 decades. And she runs a great game. And she's also a really scary cyberpunk player. So be warned. She's the one who invented the bozos, by the way, for those of you who are familiar with cyberpunk. So this should tell you. So the thing is, I like fantasy, but it's not something I usually do. And by this time, I'd kind of been messing around with the rules of D&D and going, yeah, we should be able to do this, but we can't do this. But nothing has occurred to me yet as to how to actually write a rule. And one day I go into the local game store, which actually was a paint and hardware store, which had one counter dedicated to D&D, because I think one of the owner's sons was into it. And I would go in there and buy dice and find modules and figures. And I go in, and there's this really cool looking black box. And it's got red and white on it, and it's small, and it's talking about a spaceship that's sending out an SOS. Well, for those of you who know your ancient gaming, this was the infamous Black Box Traveler, and it was the premier science fiction game many years ago. There was no Star Wars yet. And I went, okay, finally, they've given me my game. This is what I can do. I love this. So I put my pennies together, because I was still a starting college student, and I bought that copy of Traveler, and I took it back. And I started to build characters. And I found really fast that the only way to kill a character in Old Traveler is during character generation, as some of you probably remember. But other than that, it's really hard. If you get that far, the game will keep you alive forever, But I went, there's something wrong with that. So I started writing another rule. And I started writing a change in those rules. And I started coming up with, as all of us do, building house rules. And the house rules weren't bad. But the problem was they were grafted on, and they felt grafted on. So, I'm thinking, there's got to be more to this. And eventually I sit down, and as it turned out, my job at the time gave me access to a typesetting machine. I was a graphic designer. So I sit down on the typesetting machine, and I wrote a game, science fiction, called Imperial Star. And the idea was I was going to kind of do my own Traveler. And on top of it, Star Wars had just come out, so I'm thinking, yeah, I can get lightsabers in here. They haven't done lightsabers yet. So Imperial Star was interesting, because in doing it, I had to think about why a mechanic happens. I had to think about how that mechanic in the game creates the experience and maintains the experience. I had to think about the man behind the curtain. And I had to think about it not just in terms of me being the man behind the curtain, the GM, but in terms of how was that information going to get transferred to some guy on the other side of the planet who had never seen me and was never going to have me over his shoulder saying, yeah, use that rule, man. Yeah, it works for me all the time. Of course, these days, the internet, I can do that a lot more. And some of you know I sneak around the internet occasionally and drop in and say, hey, you're doing that wrong. But rarely. At any rate, I began to think differently about games. I began to look at how they go together. Why are they fun? What are the elements of entertainment? What are the elements of storytelling? What are the elements of building a world? And when you do game design at the level I do it, that is a large part of what you are doing. You are doing more than just manipulating rules. You're actually building a world for other people to enjoy. And when they do, if they have a good time, if they want to come back, if they want to change and bring things that experience that are personal, you've done your job right. But you have to basically make that quantum leap between a player and a GM to a designer. And a designer thinks in a much larger meta. The designer has to think, how is this going to happen? What rules can I put in place? What structures in this world can I build so that people will have the experience that you've offered them? You know, if I'm going to do a science fiction game, do I have to put lightsabers in? I should probably put blasters in. That's always science fiction. But do I need aliens? Do I need weird humans? What are the pieces that when people come to the table to say, I want to play science fiction, what am I going to give them? And how am I going to support that? Am I going to give them psionic powers, for example? If I do, how do I control that so that the person with psionic powers doesn't just overrun the whole game and make it no fun for anyone else at the party? So iStar was a learning experience. I had to figure out how to make these pieces work. In fact, many, many years later, I met my hero, Mark Miller, who wrote Traveler. And, you know, I came up to him and I was like, oh my gosh. But I said, you know, you're kind of to blame for me being a game designer because I started rewriting house rules based on First Traveler. And he laughed. He said, yeah, First Traveler, really hard to kill people, right? Here, I owe you. And he reached out and he pulled out a copy of a later edition of Traveler and he signed it. He autographed it. My knees shook. You know, I was like, oh my God. And I realized two things at that point. One, yeah, Mark Miller is a really cool dude. But two, that every designer looks at something they did and they look at how could I have done that better? What was missing? How do I bring forward that style and that feel? How did I miss that? You know, I figured, for example, you know, when Mark is designing Original Traveler, he realizes it's kind of hard to live to get to this game. So I'll make it hard for you to die or harder for you to die. And that way I'll balance out the experience. But somebody like me is used to, you know, stormtroopers come in and a bunch of us have a chance of dying. So therefore that should be a wider chance. And after Star Wars, he had to go take a look at the experience being offered and see that there were things people wanted beyond that. The other interesting thing that I learned from this was that characters and people are not always the same thing, but that people invest a lot in those characters. They become parts of them that they don't ever let go. And because of that, you have to respect the process of building a character. You don't necessarily want them to be total Mary Sue, but you definitely want someone who's building a character to feel like they made something. And this is one of the cool things about role-playing was it's about a cohesive and shared experience. You as the GM, or further back in the meta, you as the designer working through the GM reaches out to the player and the player creates their side of the world, how they see it, what they do in it. And that is another amazing thing about how games work. Players bring things to the table as well as the GMs and the designer up the chain. Very important. The last thing I learned when I met Mark was game designers are friendly. People have asked me, do you have a problem getting into this business? I said, no, really not. People were really friendly when I started out. Now, you know, I assume they're probably still friendly. I know I'm always friendly when I meet somebody who wants to be a designer. But that's because I feel like I have to pass it on for all the people in the industry who are willing to put up with me asking dumb questions and give me really good advice. Yeah, I still am living down the time at a convention when I'm standing there and I'm watching Steve Jackson games, and I'm a huge Star Wars fan, right? And I'm watching Steve, and I say, Mr. Jackson, can I ask you a question? And he goes, yeah. And what's it like being a game designer? And without missing a beat, Steve, the only man in gaming who has a voice deeper than mine, says, it's a lot like being a science fiction writer, but you don't have the groupies. Well said, Steve. So, but that led to a long-term friendship, and it was only the beginning of a lot of different friendships. You will find if you are willing to put the work into it and try to make the best game you can make, if you're open to asking questions, if you're open to listening to advice, people will support you. You will find people in the industry who are right behind you, and they will tell you how to put a box game together. For example, years and years ago, the Hero Games guys told us how to run a business. They will tell you how to organize things for conventions or how to look for certain theory. Iowa or Inspector, who ended up sitting next to us at one point during our first convention, and he told us how games get sold. And we went, oh, yeah, okay. So we didn't make those mistakes. People will support you. They'll back you up. They can be friendly. Now, it's not the same as video games. And I think that's partially because video games are a little more like Hollywood. The stakes are ridiculous. And there's a lot more of a problem with reaching and talking to fans directly. There's a wall there between you and the people who use your game. Many times the game doesn't even tell who made the game. It's fascinating. People, look through and go, you worked on that? Yeah, I worked on that. So I think there's a distance there. But I also think that some of that distance is the fact that I can still go build a pretty good game and maybe spend $10,000 at the most to get it printed. And when I did my first really large video game project, I went in and I said, so what are we budgeted for? And they said $20 million. And I went, I'm now responsible for figuring out what to do with $20 million. Oh, crud. So the stakes are higher. But be that as it may, even in video games, you're going to meet people, just a fewer number of them, who are willing to talk to you about how to do this mystical thing we call game design. One of the neat things is that shows like PAX, the tabletop, the video game, the board game, the card game, all those things all come together, which means when you're at a PAX, you have the opportunity to talk to a lot of people who do a lot of different types of games and are very good at it, and see if they'll tell you some stuff. Never be afraid to look at what other people are doing. It's how you learn. Walk around the floor of a convention and figure out what's happening there. What's your competition doing? But also, what are the people whose work you admire? What are they doing? I've been doing this for at least 3 decades now. And I still walk the floor looking at what's coming out, how they're doing it, how's it implemented, how toyetic, toy-like does it feel? Is it exciting? Are people gathered around looking at it? Are they trying to play it? And, there's this secret that is actually known by everybody in the business, which is at every night after we shut down dealer rooms and things like that, everybody skulks around everybody else's booth. They go, so I've got this new game here, and can I trade a copy of my new game for your game? And we go back and forth. And then by the last day of the con, people are trading furiously. I usually at a convention, I give all the crew in the convention several copies of whatever we're doing that's big. And they go out and they see what kind of deals they can put together and trade. And we come back. I swear to God, we ship as much back from a convention as we probably took out, particularly when we're doing cyberpunk stuff. So the thing is, everybody in the business likes to mess with everybody else's stuff. And they're all gamers too. And even though there's a business side of it, we do this because we really like it, because we love doing it. So spiraling back, how do I become a game designer? the first place you want to start is asking yourself, do I love this? Do I love games? Do I walk into a store and go, cool, new game, and want to play it? Do I have passion for this stuff? 2, you got to walk in there and you got to go, not just, wow, that looks really cool, I got to buy that. You got to look at it and go, I wonder how they did that. I knew my son, who's a game designer now, which I couldn't talk him out of it. But my son goes to game stores and conventions, and I watch him analyzing how the game works. And when he buys stuff, whether it's in a game store, whether it's online, whether it's at a convention, you can see him. He's taking it apart and he's looking at it. And it's funny, the two of us will buy opposite games and we'll be throwing questions back and forth back in the hotel room, like, okay, so how do they resolve this? Okay, so they're using a stacked dice mechanic, and we'll go back and forth on that. But we'll also sometimes buy the same damn game individually, like, I'll come back and I'll go, hey, I've got this now. Yeah, I have it too. And we'll both tear it apart to look at what makes it work. So you have to have that passion to figure out what's behind the game you really like. The third thing you have, to be honest, is guts. When I started, people said there's never going to be any new RPG companies. I mean, we've all got it wired, and D&D, Call of Cthulhu, Traveler, it's not going to happen. This shirt proves that that's not true, as does Vampire the Masquerade and half a dozen really, really amazing games out there that sprung up during the time when we were in the 80s and 90s. So you have to learn to say, yeah, I'm still going to do this. You may have to do another job, as in my case where I worked as a graphic designer. You may have to deal with your family and friends going, so are you really going to ever get a real job? And you're going to have to go put your head down and keep going. If you want it, you have to go get it. And because people are friendly, people talk to you at that level, ignore a lot of what the fans will say, ignore a lot of what the naysayers and guardians of the hobby say. There are people who are gatekeepers on there, but they're not the people who are writing the games. The people who are writing the games, who are doing it, the pros, they're going, yeah, okay, if you think you can do it, let's go do it. And pros will sit down and go, dude, you can't afford to do this at this price point. Have you thought about going over here and doing it like this? We're not afraid to see a really good thing because it makes the whole hobby, the whole business better. And the world we live in now, the fact that we can fill an enormous hall like PAX, following games and game-related stuff and clothing and everything else. This is amazing. 20 years ago, the idea that this culture would have existed would have been unbelievable. So you do have company. The last thing you need to do is what I've always told my students way back when I taught, which is above anything else, just go make games. There are assets out there, companies that will provide parts, will allow you to make easy prototypes. There are ways to get things into print. Over my shoulder, way the heck back there, we have our own printer at Talsorian. So when I want to find out how it's going to look and how it's going to work, I go out to that darn printer and I crank up all 20 feet of it and I make the game. Make the game so you can see it. And do not be afraid to take it out, put it in front of other players, and have them tear it apart if need be. That's the only way you're going to get a better game. And when you've done that, at some point, you're going to find something that works, something that you care about and you love, a game that is worthy of the box or worthy of the code or worthy of putting it out there on the net for people to play. And at that point, you don't need my okay. You're a game designer. You may not be a famous game designer, you may not be a rich game designer, but you're a game designer. And that's how you do it. You go back, you love games, you build on games, you try games, and you make games. And if I happen to run across you and it's not a virtual convention and we stumble across each other and you want to ask me questions, feel free. People did it for me. It's my job to do it for you. Good luck, everyone. Stay safe. I'm not wearing a mask, but I'm in a 200 square foot space of office and there's nobody here. But you guys mask up, be safe. We'll all hook up next year and we'll do PAX for real in each other's spaces.